The champagne glass slipped from my hand, shattering against the marble floor of the Grandview Country Club as I watched my fiancée Jessica wrap her arms around Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, in what was supposed to be our engagement celebration. The entire room fell silent, 200 guests frozen mid-conversation, their eyes darting between the embracing couple and me standing alone by the dessert table. Now, what made it worse wasn't just that she chose him in front of everyone we knew, but the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching. That same look she used to give me 3 years ago when we first started dating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had shown up uninvited to our engagement party, claiming he had something important to tell Jessica that couldn't wait. Within minutes of his arrival, she had excused herself from our friends and family, leaving me to explain to confused relatives why the bride-to-be was deep in conversation with some guy they'd never met. By the time I found them on the terrace overlooking the Connecticut River, Jessica was already crying, and Marcus was wiping her tears with the same gentle touch. I'd seen him use an old photo she still kept hidden in her jewelry box. The whole disaster started 3 weeks before our engagement party, when Jessica began acting strange. She'd always been organized, almost obsessively so, given her career as an event planner. But suddenly she was forgetting important details about our own celebration. Phone calls would end abruptly when I entered the room. She started working late every night, claiming she was overwhelmed with spring wedding season. I trusted her completely, which in hindsight makes me feel incredibly naive. The morning of our engagement party, Jessica seemed nervous in a way that went beyond typical event anxiety. She kept checking her phone and jumping every time it buzzed. When I asked if everything was okay, she snapped at me for the first time in our 3-year relationship, saying I was being clingy and needed to give her space to handle the final preparations. I backed off, thinking she was just stressed about wanting everything to be perfect for our families. The Grandview Country Club looked absolutely stunning that evening. Jessica had outdone herself with the decorations, white roses, and soft lighting creating the perfect romantic atmosphere. Our families mingled beautifully, and my business partner David was charming everyone with stories about our marketing company's recent successes. Tyler, my best friend since college, was documenting everything with his camera, making jokes about how he'd better get photo credit when we used these pictures for our wedding invitations. Everything felt perfect until Marcus walked through the main entrance at exactly 8:30, wearing an expensive navy suit that I recognized as the same brand Jessica had suggested I buy for the party. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged there. And I noticed several guests do double takes, clearly wondering who this handsome stranger was and why he looked so familiar. Jessica spotted him immediately, even though she was across the room talking to my parents about our upcoming wedding plans. The color drained from her face, and she excused herself so abruptly that my mother asked if she was feeling ill. I watched Jessica navigate through the crowd toward Marcus, and something about her body language made my stomach drop. She wasn't surprised to see him. She was nervous, but not surprised. Their conversation started quietly near the entrance, but within minutes, they had moved toward the outdoor terrace. I tried to continue mingling with our guests, but I couldn't focus on anything anyone was saying. My aunt was telling me about her recent trip to Italy. I kept nodding and smiling while my attention was completely focused on the glass doors leading outside. Tyler noticed my distraction and followed my gaze toward the terrace. He'd been my roommate in college and knew me better than anyone, so he immediately picked up on my concern. Without saying anything, he positioned himself near the windows, where he could keep an eye on the situation while continuing to take photos of the party. His subtle nod toward the doors confirmed what I already suspected: something was seriously wrong. When I finally couldn't stand it anymore and went looking for them, I found Jessica and Marcus standing close together by the stone railing overlooking the river. She was crying, and he had his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that was far too intimate for someone who was supposedly just an old friend. The sight hit me like a physical blow, but what came next was even worse. Jessica looked up at Marcus with an expression of pure longing and said something I couldn't quite hear from where I was standing. Whatever she said made him smile and pull her into that embrace that would shatter not just my champagne glass, but everything I thought I knew about the woman I was planning to marry. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Jessica didn't even try to explain or apologize. Instead, she stood there holding Marcus's hand while our guests whispered and stared, waiting for someone to say something that would make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Her mother, Linda, rushed over, clearly mortified by the scene her daughter was creating, but Jessica ignored her completely. Marcus, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with the public nature of what was happening. He whispered something to Jessica about talking privately, but she shook her head and announced to the entire party that she needed to be honest about her feelings. The room was so quiet you could hear the classical music playing from the speakers in the corner, a romantic playlist that now felt like a cruel joke. What happened next would change everything, but not in the way anyone expected. As I stood there watching my relationship dissolve in front of 200 people, I caught sight of Emma, Jessica's younger sister, standing near the bar with tears in her eyes. She wasn't crying because of embarrassment or family drama. She was crying because she could see how much this was hurting me, and in that moment, I realized she might be the only person in the room who truly understood what I was going through. Emma approached me slowly, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as the chaos continued around us. She handed me a cocktail napkin without saying a word, and I realized I must have looked as devastated as I felt. The simple gesture meant more to me in that moment than all the awkward apologies and pitying looks from the other guests combined. "I'm so sorry, Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of confused conversations happening. Throughout the room, I had no idea she was going to do this. None of us did. I wanted to believe her, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely surprised by Jessica's behavior. Emma had always been the more observant sister, the one who noticed details that others missed. As a graphic designer, she was trained to see patterns and inconsistencies, and I suspected she'd picked up on things about Jessica's recent behavior that I'd been too trusting to recognize. The next few hours were a blur of uncomfortable conversations and hasty departures. Jessica and Marcus had disappeared entirely, leaving me to face the aftermath alone. Linda, Jessica's mother, was frantically trying to do damage control, telling anyone who would listen that there must be some misunderstanding, that Jessica was probably just overwhelmed by wedding stress. But even she couldn't explain why her daughter had left her own engagement party with another man. Tyler stayed by my side the entire evening, deflecting questions from curious relatives and helping coordinate the early cleanup when it became clear the party was effectively over. David, my business partner, handled the practical details with the country club staff, making sure all the vendors were paid and the deposits handled properly. Their loyalty meant everything to me during those surreal hours when my entire life plan was falling apart in real time. Emma lingered long after most of the guests had left, helping pack up the gifts and personal items while her mother made increasingly frantic phone calls trying to reach Jessica. I kept expecting Emma to make excuses and leave, to distance herself from the embarrassment her sister had caused, but instead she seemed determined to help clean up the mess Jessica had left behind. "She's not answering her phone," Linda announced after her 10th attempt to call Jessica. "This is completely unlike her. Something must be wrong." Emma and I exchanged a look across the room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We both knew nothing was wrong with Jessica in the traditional sense. She had simply made a choice, and that choice didn't include me. The painful truth was that Jessica had probably been planning this moment for weeks, maybe longer. The strange behavior, the secretive phone calls, the sudden emotional distance, all of it made perfect sense now. "Mom, I think we need to accept that Jessica knew exactly what she was doing tonight," Emma said gently, her voice carrying a maturity that belied her 24 years. "This wasn't a spur-of-a-moment decision. She's been different for weeks." Linda's face crumpled at her younger daughter's words, and I felt a wave of sympathy for her. None of this was her fault, and she was clearly devastated by Jessica's public humiliation of our family. The engagement party had been as much for the parents as for Jessica and me, a celebration of two families coming together. It would be remembered as the night everything fell apart. The drive home to the house Jessica and I shared in Maple Ridge was one of the longest of my life. Tyler offered to come with me, but I needed to face the reality of the situation alone. Our house, which had always felt warm and welcoming, now seemed cold and unfamiliar. Jessica's belongings were everywhere, reminders of the life we'd built together over 3 years. I found myself wandering through the rooms, looking for clues I might have missed. In her home office, I discovered a stack of printed emails that she'd apparently forgotten to delete. They were correspondence with Marcus dating back 6 weeks, discussing everything from his fitness business expansion to memories of their college relationship. The emails weren't explicitly romantic, but the tone was intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. One email in particular caught my attention. Marcus had written about feeling lost after his recent breakup with his long-term girlfriend, and Jessica had responded with detailed advice and emotional support. She'd shared personal details about our relationship that felt like a betrayal, even beyond what had happened at the party. Reading her casual dismissal of our future plans was more painful than watching her embrace him in public. My phone buzzed constantly throughout the night with messages from friends and family members who'd witnessed the disaster. Most were offering support and expressing shock at Jessica's behavior, but a few were asking for details I wasn't ready to share. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw Jessica's face when she looked at Marcus on the terrace. The next morning brought a harsh reality check. Jessica's belongings were still scattered throughout our house, but she clearly wasn't coming home. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and there were no missed calls or messages on my phone. The silence was somehow worse than if she'd called to fight or offer explanations. Tyler arrived around noon with coffee and bagels, taking one look at my appearance and immediately suggesting we get out of the house. We drove to our old college hangout spot by the lake, where we'd spent countless afternoons during our university years, discussing everything from career goals to relationship dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now discussing the end of my engagement in the same place where I'd once talked about proposing. I keep thinking I must have missed something obvious, I told Tyler as we sat on the familiar wooden dock. 3 years together, and I had no idea she was still in love with someone else. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, throwing stones into the water while he considered his response. As a photographer, he was used to observing people and situations from different angles, and I valued his perspective more than anyone else's. Maybe she didn't know either, he finally said. People can convince themselves they're over someone until that person shows up again. But that doesn't excuse the way she handled it, Ryan. You deserved honesty, not a public humiliation. His words hit home because they acknowledged something I'd been struggling to accept. Part of me wanted to hate Jessica completely, to paint her as a villain who deliberately deceived me. But the truth was more complicated. She might have genuinely believed she was over Marcus until he reappeared in her life. The real betrayal wasn't that she still had feelings for him, but that she'd chosen to act on those feelings without giving me a chance to step aside gracefully. We spent the afternoon talking through 3 years of memories, looking for signs I might have missed. Tyler reminded me of Jessica's reaction when Marcus's name had come up in conversations. How she'd always changed the subject quickly or made dismissive comments about their past relationship. At the time, I'd interpreted her discomfort as embarrassment about dating someone so different from me. Now I wondered if it had been unresolved feelings all along. As the sun began to set over the lake, my phone finally rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and my heart jumped despite everything that had happened. Tyler gestured for me to answer, positioning himself where he could hear both sides of the conversation. Ryan, I know you probably don't want to talk to me. Jessica's voice sounded strained and tired. But we need to discuss what happens next. There are practical things we need to figure out. Her matter-of-fact tone caught me off guard. I'd expected tears, apologies, maybe even anger, but not this businesslike approach to dismantling our life together. It was as if she'd already moved past the emotional impact of what she'd done and was ready to handle the logistics. Hey, where are you, Jessica? I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. I'm staying at Marcus's place temporarily, she said, confirming what I had already suspected. I know how this looks, but I needed time to think, and I couldn't go back to the house right now. The casual way she mentioned Marcus's place stung more than I expected. She'd moved in with him less than 24 hours after our engagement party. As if our 3 years together could be erased that quickly. The speed of her transition suggested this had been planned longer than she was willing to admit. Conversation was brief and focused on immediate practical concerns. Who would handle canceling our upcoming wedding venue? How to divide our shared belongings? What to tell our respective employers about the sudden change in our relationship status? Jessica spoke about these details with the same efficiency she brought to planning events for her clients, as if our breakup was just another project to manage. When I hung up, Tyler was studying my expression carefully. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Angry," I admitted. It's not heartbroken the way I expected to be, but furious at how she's handling this. It's like our entire relationship meant nothing to her. That anger would fuel what happened next, leading me down a path I never could have imagined just days earlier. As we drove back toward town, I found myself thinking about Emma's quiet strength during the chaos of the previous evening, and wondering why I'd never really noticed how different she was from her sister. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally happened 3 days later at the Blue Harbor restaurant, where Jessica had insisted we meet to discuss dividing our assets. She arrived 20 minutes late, looking polished and composed in a way that immediately irritated me. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, as if she was heading to a business meeting rather than the dissolution of our relationship. What made it worse was that she wasn't alone. Marcus sat in his car outside, visible through the restaurant's large windows, apparently waiting to drive her home afterward. The message was clear: she'd already moved on completely, and I was just an inconvenient detail to be handled efficiently. "You look terrible," were the first words out of Jessica's mouth as she slid into the booth across from me. "Are you sleeping at all?" Her concern felt patronizing, especially since she was the reason for my sleepless nights. I'd spent the past 3 days alternating between fury and disbelief, trying to understand how someone I'd trusted completely could have deceived me so thoroughly. The emails I'd found were just the beginning. A deeper search through our shared cloud storage had revealed months of communication that painted a very different picture of our relationship than I'd believed. "I've been better," I said, keeping my voice level. "Let's just get through this, Jessica. You have somewhere else to be?" She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable at my reference to Marcus waiting outside, but she quickly recovered and pulled out a folder filled with printed documents. Everything was organized with her typical attention to detail, from property division to cancellation notices for our wedding vendors. She'd clearly spent considerable time preparing for this meeting, probably with Marcus's input. "I've already contacted the wedding venue and most of our vendors," she said, sliding papers across the table. "The financial hit isn't as bad as it could have been since we're canceling with sufficient notice. I'm willing to split the lost deposits 50-50, even though technically this is my fault." Her clinical approach to dismantling our life together was almost surreal. She discussed our relationship like a failed business venture, complete with liability assessments and financial calculations. There was no mention of the emotional devastation she'd caused, no acknowledgement of the humiliation I'd suffered in front of our friends and families. "What about the house?" I asked, flipping through the documents she'd prepared. "I think you should keep it," she said without hesitation. "You're more established in your career right now, and the mortgage is primarily in your name anyway. I'll sign over my portion of the equity in exchange for some of the other assets." The speed with which she was willing to give up our home revealed more about her state of mind than anything else she'd said. Jessica had always been attached to that house, spending hours planning renovations and talking about raising children there someday. Her eagerness to walk away suggested she'd already mentally moved into a different future, one that didn't include any reminders of our time together. "This is all very convenient for you," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You've got everything figured out, including your new living arrangements." Jessica's composure cracked slightly at my words. She glanced toward the window where Marcus's car was parked, then back at me with something that might have been guilt or regret. "Ryan, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be," she said, her professional tone softening. "And I need you to understand that I never meant for things to happen this way." When Marcus contacted me 6 weeks ago about possibly working together on some fitness industry events, I thought I could handle it professionally. 6 weeks?
Yeah.
I interrupted. You've been talking to him for 6 weeks and never mentioned it. Once, she nodded, looking down at her hands. At first, it really was just business. His gym is expanding, and he needed someone to help plan their grand opening event. But when we started working together, all these old feelings came rushing back. I tried to ignore them. I really did, but you decided to explore them instead of talking to me about it. I finished for her. You made a choice to pursue this behind my back while planning our engagement party at the same time. Jessica's face flushed, and for the first time since. Sitting down, she looked genuinely ashamed. I know how it sounds, but it wasn't that calculated. The feelings just kept getting stronger, and I couldn't figure out how to handle them. By the time I realized how serious it was, we were too close to the engagement party to call it off without causing a huge scene. So instead, you decided to cause an even bigger scene by embracing him in front of 200 people. My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. That was your solution? Marcus wasn't supposed to come to the party, she said quickly. He showed up without warning because he'd heard about the engagement and wanted to tell me he couldn't work with me anymore if I was getting married. When I saw him there, I just lost control of the situation. Her explanation only made me angrier. She was painting herself as a victim of circumstances rather than someone who had made deliberate choices to betray our relationship. The 6 weeks of secret communication, the emotional affair disguised as business planning, the lies about working late, all of it had been conscious decisions. You lost control, I repeated slowly. That's what you're calling it when you chose. To humiliate me in front of everyone we know? Jessica winced at my words, but she didn't deny them. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I found myself studying her face, looking for traces of the woman I'd fallen in love with 3 years earlier. She was still beautiful, still put together, but something fundamental had changed. The warmth I'd always associated with Jessica was gone, replaced by a cool efficiency that felt like talking to a stranger. What happens now? I asked finally. I don't know, she admitted. Marcus and I are taking things slowly, trying to figure out what this means for both of us. He ended a long-term relationship recently too, so we're both dealing with complicated emotions. The casual way she mentioned his breakup hit me like a physical blow. She was already thinking of them as a couple with shared challenges to overcome, while I was still processing the fact that our relationship was over. The speed of her emotional transition was staggering. I hope it works out for you, I said, surprised to realize I meant it. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something closer to relief. If Jessica could move on this quickly, if her feelings for me had been shallow enough to be replaced within weeks, then maybe I was better off without her. She seemed surprised by my response, perhaps expecting more fight or drama. Thank you, she said quietly. I know that can't be easy to say. It's not, I agreed. But I'd rather know the truth than live with someone who's pretending to love me. After Jessica left, I sat in the restaurant for another hour, nursing a coffee and processing everything she'd told me. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. She'd been emotionally cheating for weeks while actively planning our engagement party, lying to my face every day while exploring a relationship with someone else. The drive home took me past Emma's apartment complex in Harborview, and on impulse, I pulled into the parking lot. I'd been thinking about her quiet support during the disaster at the country club, how she'd been the only person who seemed to truly understand what I was going through. Emma had always been kind to me during family gatherings, but I'd never really gotten to know her separately from Jessica. I found her apartment number and knocked, half expecting her not to be home. When she opened the door, she looked genuinely surprised to see me, but not unwelcoming. She was wearing paint-splattered clothes and had her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, clearly in the middle of working on something artistic. "Ryan, is everything okay?" she asked, stepping aside to let me in. Her apartment was small, but beautifully decorated, filled with her own artwork and photography. It felt warm and personal in a way that contrasted sharply with the sterile efficiency of my conversation with Jessica. Emma offered me tea and listened without judgment as I told her about the meeting at the restaurant. She's always been like that when she's made up her mind about something, Emma said thoughtfully. Even when we were kids, once Jessica decided she wanted something different, she could just flip a switch and move on like the past never happened. Her observation was both insightful and painful. It suggested that Jessica's behavior, while shocking to me, wasn't entirely out of character. For someone who knew her well, Emma had probably seen her sister compartmentalize emotions and relationships before. I keep wondering what I missed, I confessed. How someone can just stop loving you without giving any real warning. Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that reminded me she was an artist, trained to see details others missed. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but honest. I don't think she stopped loving you, Ryan. I think she never learned how to love someone completely in the first place. Jessica has always been attracted to the idea of relationships more than the reality of them. When things get complicated or require real emotional work, she finds reasons to start over with someone new. Her words offered a perspective I hadn't considered, reframing Jessica's betrayal as a character flaw rather than a reflection of my own inadequacy. For the first time since the engagement party, I felt something other than anger or sadness. I felt clarity, sitting in Emma's cozy living room, surrounded by evidence of her creativity and depth. I began to understand that losing Jessica might not be the tragedy I'd thought it was. Instead, it might be the beginning of something entirely different. The weeks following my conversation with Emma marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a complete life transformation. What started as casual coffee meetings to discuss the ongoing fallout from Jessica's public betrayal gradually evolved into something much deeper and more meaningful. Emma had a way of listening that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't experienced in years, even during the supposedly happy times with Jessica. Our friendship developed naturally around shared interests I never knew we had. Emma introduced me to local art galleries and photography exhibitions that opened my eyes to creative worlds I'd been too busy with work to explore. In return, I helped her understand the business side of her artistic pursuits, sharing marketing strategies that could help her turn her passion into a sustainable career. David, my business partner, noticed the change in my demeanor almost immediately, where I'd been distracted and bitter in the immediate aftermath of the engagement disaster. I was now focused and energized in ways that surprised even me. Marketing firm had been struggling to break into new creative industries, and my newfound appreciation for the arts led to several breakthrough client acquisitions. "You're different," David observed during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "I mean that in the best possible way. It's like you've remembered who you were before Jessica started managing every aspect of your life." His comment hit me harder than he probably intended. Looking back, I could see how much of myself I'd surrendered during my relationship with Jessica. Her strong personality and definitive opinions had gradually replaced my own preferences and interests. I'd stopped reading the books I enjoyed, abandoned hobbies she found boring, and even changed my style to match her vision of who I should be. Emma never tried to change me or offer unsolicited advice about how I should be handling my recovery. Instead, she simply existed in my life as a calm, supportive presence who seemed genuinely interested in understanding who I was beneath the layers of hurt and confusion. Her approach was so different from Jessica's constant need to improve and optimize everything around her. One evening in late July, Emma invited me to attend one of her art classes at the Riverside Community Center. She taught mixed media workshops for adults, helping people explore creativity regardless of their skill level. I'd never considered myself artistic, but something about her enthusiasm convinced me to try. The class was filled with people from all walks of life, from retired teachers to young professionals looking for stress relief after long workdays. Emma moved between students with natural grace, offering encouragement and technical guidance without making anyone feel judged for their inexperience. Watching her work with others showed me a side of her personality that was confident and nurturing in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. My own artistic attempts were admittedly terrible, but Emma's genuine delight in my efforts made the experience enjoyable rather than embarrassing. She had a gift for finding something positive in everyone's work, while still providing constructive feedback that helped them improve. Her teaching style reflected the same thoughtful approach she brought to our conversations. You have good instincts for color balance, she said, studying my abstract attempt at landscape painting. Most beginners are afraid to use bold contrasts. But you're naturally drawn to combinations that create visual interest. Her praise felt different from the compliments Jessica used to give me. Where Jessica's encouragement often came with subtle suggestions for improvement, Emma seemed to appreciate my efforts exactly as they were. The difference was subtle but profound, representing an entirely different philosophy about relationships and personal growth. As summer progressed, Emma and I began spending time together outside of formal activities. Weekend trips to farmers markets, long walks along the Connecticut River, quiet dinners at small restaurants where we could talk without interruption. These weren't dates exactly, but they felt more intimate and meaningful than many of the elaborate outings Jessica had planned during our relationship. The turning point came in August, when Emma's landlord announced that her apartment building was being converted to condominiums, forcing all the tenants to either buy their units or find new housing within 60 days. The stress of unexpected displacement, combined with the financial pressure of purchasing property as a freelance artist, left her feeling overwhelmed in a way I'd never seen before. "I love that apartment," she confessed during one of our riverside walks. "It's the first place that's ever really felt like home to me. But the purchase price is just beyond what I can afford right now, especially with the uncertainty in my income." Without thinking, I offered to help her explore financing options. Maybe even co-sign a loan if that would make the purchase possible. Emma's immediate response was to politely decline, saying she couldn't accept that kind of financial assistance from a friend. But something about her reluctance seemed to have less to do with money and more to do with the implications of accepting help from me specifically. "Is this about Jessica?" I asked directly. "Are you worried about what people would think if you let me help you?" Emma stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "It's not about what other people think, Ryan. It's about what I think and what you think. We've been dancing around something for months now, and I'm not sure either of us is ready to acknowledge what it is." Her honesty forced me to confront feelings I'd been carefully avoiding. Somewhere between the art classes and long conversations, between her quiet support and genuine interest in my thoughts and dreams, I'd begun to fall for Emma in a way that felt completely different from my relationship with Jessica. The attraction wasn't based on physical chemistry or shared social circles or any of the practical considerations that had initially drawn me to her sister. Instead, it was rooted in a deeper compatibility that made me feel like I could be completely myself, without fear of judgment or rejection. "What if we are ready?" I asked, surprised by my own boldness. "What if we stop pretending this is just friendship and admitted that we're both feeling something more?" Emma's smile was soft but conflicted. "Then we'd have to deal with the fact that this started as the worst possible time and under the most complicated circumstances imaginable. My sister left you at your own engagement party 3 months ago, Ryan. People are going to think this is some kind of revenge plot or rebound situation." She was right about the optics, but I also knew that what I felt for Emma had nothing to do with getting back at Jessica or filling an emotional void. If anything, my growing feelings for Emma had helped me understand how shallow and performance-based my relationship with Jessica had really been. "Let them think what they want," I said, reaching for her hand. "We know the truth about how this developed. We know it's real." Emma didn't pull away, but she didn't immediately respond either. We stood there by the river, holding hands while she processed the implications of taking our relationship to the next level. The silence stretched between us, filled with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. "If we do this," she said finally, "we have to be absolutely sure about what we're feeling. Because once we cross that line, there's no going back to just being friends. And if it doesn't work out between us, I lose not just a romantic relationship, but the best friendship I've had in years." Her concern was valid and showed the thoughtful approach she brought to important decisions. Unlike her sister's impulsive leap from one relationship to another, Emma wanted to carefully consider the consequences before making any commitments. "I'm sure," I told her, and meant it completely. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, we had dinner at her apartment, cooking together and talking late into the evening about what a relationship between us might look like. Emma's approach to the conversation was characteristically thoughtful, discussing potential challenges and how we might handle them together. The difference between planning a future with Emma and the way Jessica had approached our relationship was striking. Where Jessica had been focused on external appearances and social expectations, Emma was interested in building something authentic that could withstand whatever complications might arise. I finally kissed her goodnight at her door. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. It's not rushed or desperate, but right in a way that confirmed everything we'd been feeling but hadn't yet acknowledged. As I drove home that night, I realized that losing Jessica hadn't been a tragedy after all. It had been the best thing that could have happened to me. The opportunity for perfect revenge came 6 months later at Jessica and Marcus's engagement party, held at the very same Grandview Country Club, where my own relationship had imploded. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who attended both events, and apparently Jessica thought enough time had passed that people would view this as a heartwarming love story rather than a public betrayal finally reaching its logical conclusion. Emma had received an invitation, which surprised both of us given the circumstances. Linda, their mother, had insisted that family obligations trumped personal drama, and Emma felt pressured to attend despite her obvious discomfort with the situation. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Emma asked if I would accompany her as moral support. "I can't face this alone," she admitted, while we discussed the invitation over dinner. Watching Jessica celebrate with Marcus while pretending the past year never happened is going to be harder than I thought. We've been together for 4 months. By then, our relationship having evolved into something deeper and more stable than I'd ever experienced. Emma had successfully purchased her apartment with my help, though we'd structured it as a business investment rather than a romantic gesture. Her art career was flourishing, and she'd even landed a commission to create pieces for several local restaurants and offices. The night of Jessica's engagement party, Emma looked stunning in a midnight blue dress that complemented her artistic sensibilities. As we walked into the country club, I couldn't help but remember standing in the same entrance 8 months earlier, watching my life fall apart in front of 200 guests. Tonight felt different, though. I was here by choice, supporting someone I genuinely cared about, rather than playing a role in someone else's performance. Jessica spotted us immediately, her face registering shock and something that might have been anger when she saw me beside her sister. She'd put on weight since our breakup, and the stress of planning another engagement party so soon after destroying the last one showed in her face. Marcus stood beside her, looking uncomfortable. As he recognized me from their dramatic public debut, "What is he doing here?" Jessica hissed to Emma during their first interaction of the evening. "This is supposed to be my special night." Emma's response was calm but firm. "Ryan is my guest, and unless you want to create another scene in front of all your friends, I suggest you focus on your own celebration." The party proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that most guests seemed to pick up on. People kept glancing between Emma and me, clearly wondering about the nature of our relationship. Tyler, who had also been invited as a mutual friend, positioned himself nearby and gave me a knowing look that suggested he approved of how things had developed. The real drama began during the traditional engagement toasts. Jessica had apparently planned an elaborate speech about true love and second chances, clearly attempting to rewrite the narrative of how her relationship with Marcus had begun. As she stood at the microphone, talking about destiny and soulmates, I noticed Emma growing increasingly tense beside me. "I can't listen to this," Emma whispered. "She's acting like she's some kind of romantic heroine instead of someone who publicly humiliated you to be with him." That's when inspiration struck. If Jessica could rewrite history to make herself look better, then I could create a new story entirely. The ring I'd bought for Jessica was still in my possession, returned after our breakup but never exchanged. It had been sitting in my dresser drawer for months, an expensive reminder of failed plans. During a lull in Jessica's speech, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The crowd fell silent, clearly expecting some kind of confrontation or dramatic outburst. Instead, I pulled out the ring box and turned to face Emma, who was staring at me with wide eyes from her seat. "Emma," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I know this isn't how we planned it, and I know the timing is unconventional, but I can't think of a better moment to tell you how I really feel." The shock on Jessica's face was immediately replaced by rage as she realized what was about to happen. Marcus grabbed her arm to prevent her from interrupting, but she was frozen in place anyway. watching her sister become the center of attention at what was supposed to be her own celebration. "You've shown me what real love looks like," I continued, walking toward Emma. Not the performance version or the social media version, but the quiet, steady kind that makes everything else in life better. "You've made me a better person without trying to change who I am." Emma's eyes filled with tears as I dropped to one knee in front of her chair. The entire room was silent except for the sound of Jessica's sharp intake of breath behind me. "Emma, will you marry me?" Her yes was immediate and breathless, followed by applause from the guests that was notably more enthusiastic than anything Jessica had received during her own speeches. As I slipped the ring onto Emma's finger, I caught sight of Jessica's expression, a mixture of fury, humiliation, and disbelief that perfectly mirrored what I'd felt 8 months earlier. The aftermath was swift and predictable. Jessica stormed out of her own engagement party, with Marcus trailing behind her trying to salvage the situation. Linda was torn between congratulating her younger daughter and chasing after her older one. Most of the guests seemed delighted by the unexpected turn of events, many of them having witnessed the original disaster and apparently feeling that justice had been served. Tyler captured the entire proposal on camera, later telling me it was the most satisfying photography assignment of his career. David immediately began planning how to incorporate the story into our company's marketing materials, joking that our personal drama was better advertising than anything we could have paid for. Emma and I left the party early, driving to our favorite spot by the river to process what had just happened. She kept staring at the ring on her finger, shaking her head in amazement. "I can't believe you just did that," she said, laughing through tears. In front of everyone, at Jessica's party, with her own ring. "It was never her ring," I corrected. "It was always meant for the right person. It just took me a while to figure out who that was." We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at Emma's art studio, surrounded by close friends and family who had supported us through the unconventional beginning of our relationship. Jessica didn't attend, having cut off contact with Emma entirely after the engagement party incident. Marcus, interestingly, reached out to congratulate us, apparently having gained some perspective on Jessica's behavior patterns during their own relationship struggles. Looking back now, I realized that Jessica's betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. It freed me from a relationship that was all surface and no substance, and led me to someone who loved me for who I actually was rather than who she wanted me to become. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually redirecting us toward something much better than we could have imagined. The engagement ring that was supposed to represent my future with Jessica became the symbol of my real future with Emma. And unlike Jessica's dramatic public declarations of love, our relationship was built on quiet moments, shared laughter, and the kind of deep compatibility that doesn't need an audience to validate it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout
Stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.